The following is an excerpt from Captured by Desire by Kira Morgan, read by the author.
Rain's fingers circled with practiced ease around the leather grip of the longbow, and he slowly raised it to eye level, hooking in and drawing back on the sinew until the bow arced and his thumb rested against his cheek. The thrashing grew louder. He narrowed his eyes against the fast-fading light, straining to see into the deep shadows of the wood. 'Twas reckless to hunt this way, he thought, cursing the desperation that drove him to do so. Not only did he risk his life by poaching on royal lands, but 'twas also foolhardy to use a bow when he could barely discern his prey, much less get off a clean shot. Still, the animal was almost out in the open now. He heard the snap of twigs as it slowed, cautiously approaching the widening of the trail. Through the drooping branches by the failing light, he at last caught a glimpse of what he thought was the broad side of a deer. The instant before he released the arrow, the creature moved forward out of the shadows, and he saw 'twas not a deer at all. But 'twas too late to prevent his shot, and only his lightning-quick reflexes prevented the bolt from landing with deadly accuracy. Still it sank with a sickening thud into flesh, and the piercing cry that followed staggered him, as if he'd taken the arrow himself. The pain was shocking, intense. Florrie's first thought was that a wolf had sprung at her from the brush, sinking its fangs into her thigh. She screamed, but the sound was cut off as she twisted and fell, colliding hard with the earth. Knocked breathless, for an instant she lay stunned. Then, fearing to be devoured, she kicked desperate heels into the decaying leaf fall, scrambling, clambering, scraping dirt beneath her nails as she struggled to escape the unrelenting burn of the teeth embedded in her flesh. No beast snarled or sprang to finish her, but neither did the stabbing pain in her legs subside. She wrenched about to discover the demon wreaking such agony. The sight left her faint with horror. An arrow pinned her through a trailing link of her gold girdle and her skirts, its steel head buried in her flesh, its thick shaft bobbing as she writhed in pain. The edges of perception blurred then, and she felt herself tilting, fading, falling into a cavern of seductive oblivion. Rain's bowstring was still vibrating when the blood drained from his face and his arms dropped limp at his sides. "Bloody hell," he breathed. Casting off the bow, he charged forward into the open meadow, his heart hammering. He bolted for the trail toward his fallen prey, hurtling along the pond's edge, around its perimeter, whipping past reeds and ferns, snapping off bracken as he ran. When he reached his victim, he dropped his quiver to the ground and fell to his knees with a bitter cry. "Ah!" Guilt threatened to unman him, and he ground his teeth against a wave of self-loathing. Faith, he'd shot a child. Then he peered closer by the fading twilight. Nay, not a child, a slight, slender lass. Though she lay as still as death, she wasn't dead. Thank God he'd been able to redirect the arrow at the last moment, thus sparing her life. He turned her carefully toward him, and she revived with a wheezing gasp, reflexively scrabbling at the outside of her thigh where his arrow obscenely protruded. "Nay," he cautioned, "leave it be." Her eyes widened, and he instantly withdrew his hands, trying not to panic her, raising his palms in what he hoped was a placating gesture. The last thing he expected was the sting of a sharp needle through his open hand. He grunted in pain, drawing back his wounded palm. Blood welled from the puncture. He sucked a sharp hiss through his teeth. The needle had pierced him deeply. It hurt like the devil, but he supposed he should have known better. After all, only a fool approached a wounded animal. Her left arm arced toward him again with whatever vicious weapon she wielded. He lunged aside. "Nay, lass, I mean, you know—" His words were cut short as her right fist clipped his jaw. "Ugh!" The needle returned to graze his bare neck, leaving a stinging trail. "Son of a... lass, cease! 'Twas an accident!" She ignored his command, attacking him again and again, as if she intended to fight him to the death. Odin's eyes, if she didn't stop thrashing about, she'd drive the arrow deeper into her thigh. "Woman!" he finally bellowed, startling her into momentary submission. "Put away your weapon. I'm friend, not foe." Florrie didn't believe him for an instant. Whether he was Gilbert's man, she couldn't tell. 'Twas too dark to make out his face or the colour of his tabard. But the bastard had shot her. Shot her! She'd managed to wound him with her brooch pin. She'd heard his grunt, felt the point sink into his flesh. But she'd not inflicted enough damage to stop him. And if she didn't, if he turned her over to the law... Fighting for her life, she stabbed forward with the brooch again. This time he was prepared for her attack. He caught her wrist in a steely grip. Thrashing against his punishing hold, she tried to pry his fingers away with her free hand, but he gave her wrist a sharp flick, and the brooch flew loose, skittering out of reach. "Lie still," he commanded. "You'll only make it worse." Worse? What could be worse? Florrie wasn't about to surrender, regardless of the wave of dizziness that assailed her, regardless of the dire stain widening on her best brocade skirts, regardless of the drops of blood, her blood, dripping onto the leaves of the forest floor. Summoning up one last desperate burst of power, she reared back her closed fist and swung forward as hard as she could, aiming for his jaw. But he ducked easily out of the way, seizing that hand as well. "For the love of Freya, lass, lie still!" The edges of her vision dimmed, darkening as her bones dissolved into submission, and she vaguely wondered who the devil Freya was. Bloody hell. Maybe the archer had dealt her a mortal wound and she was dying, for she felt as weak as a bairn, with neither the strength nor the will to move. "Nay, nay, 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 nay," he shouted, giving her wrists a reviving shake. "Not that still." His voice, for all its vehemence, sounded distant, dreamlike. "Stay awake, do you hear me?" "Ye go to hell," she mumbled. He cursed under his breath, returning her arms to her sides, where they lay as limp and useless as empty sleeves. "Fa, lass," he murmured as if to himself. "What were you doing, stealing through the thicket like that?" "Leave me alone." "If I leave you alone, you'll bleed to He shook his head. "I'm not leaving."
Want to read more? Look for Captured by Desire by Kira Morgan at bookstores everywhere, August 2010, from Grand Central Publishing.